If God died on the cross, then we have an impossibility, since God can't die. So who died? The pseudo-prophet Hal Lindsey got entangled in this very problem on page 83 in his book entitled The Liberation of Planet Earth by saying, quote, "What is sin's penalty? Death. Can God die? Obviously not. Therefore, the one who would take the penalty for man had to be a true human being as well as truly God," unquote. Lindsey emphatically stated that God cannot die, and in the very next sentence said that God did die, or at the very least was a component of that which died. In no sense can God die. So the question remains, who or what died on the cross? While we're on the subject of dying for a cause, it is altogether appropriate that we should note one of the most prominent pieces of Christian mythology to have ever come down the pike. Where does the Bible mention any Christians dying for Christianity, other than Stephen and possibly John the Baptist? Yet on page 96 in his book entitled Practical Apologetics, the apologist Josh McDowell lists 12 apostles and the means by which they died for the cause without providing as much as a shred of biblical support. Besides the crucifixion, the ascension is also closely associated with the resurrection and has a major problem. Luke 24, 50-51 says the ascension occurred at Bethany. Mark 16, 14 and 19 say the actual location was a room in Jerusalem. And Acts 1, 9-12 says it took place on Mount Olivet. Although these three places are near one another, they are not the same, despite the assertions of some apologists to the contrary. Before leaving the resurrection and related subjects, it is important to remember that Judaism had no conception of a dying Messiah to begin with. On page 54 in the book entitled Answers to Tough Questions, McDowell and Stewart admitted as much by saying, quote, "First century Judaism had no concept of a dying and rising Messiah." One Jewish writer, Shmuel Golding, stated this fact in even more stark terms on page 15 in his book entitled The Light of Reason, Volume 1. He said, quote, "That God should clothe himself in the body of a man, live 9 months in the womb of a woman, suck the breasts and have his diapers changed is clearly of pagan origin. The Pauline concepts of sin, sacrifice, and salvation obtained by belief in a man dying on a cross do not exist in and are in no way a fulfillment of the Hebrew Scriptures," that is, the Old Testament. Moving on from the resurrection and surrounding events, we turn to another subject of crucial importance to the career and qualifications of Jesus, namely his genealogy. One of the most discussed contradictions in free thought literature is the clash between the genealogies of Jesus found in Matthew 1 and Luke 3. One need only read the text to see that Luke traces the genealogy of Jesus from Jesus back to Adam, while Matthew begins with Abraham and tracks it down to Jesus. Luke lists 77 generations, while Matthew has only 44. In order to see the problem in proper perspective, one need only create a chart listing the names in correct sequence in parallel columns. That is, 2 columns. If horizontal lines are drawn across to connect the same names, one can easily see that the lists are almost identical from Abraham down to David. However, from David onward, there is little similarity, despite the fact that they both conclude with Joseph as the father of Jesus. The major reason for the contradictory names given after David is that the account in Luke traces the genealogy through David's son Nathan, while that in Matthew traces it through another son, Solomon. This would easily account for the wide divergence in names following David, but raises a couple of crucial questions. A, how could Joseph be descended from two different sons of David? How could two sons of David father two completely different genealogies which merged together in the last two individuals, Joseph and Jesus? And B, how could Jesus have contradictory genealogies? Almost no one denies differences are present, so that's not a topic of dispute. The real issue revolves around the common explanation given by most biblicist for two widely different ancestral histories of the same man. Their strategy hinges on a rather simple ploy. They contend that Jesus' genealogy is traced through Joseph in Matthew and Mary in Luke. In other words, the genealogy in Matthew is that of Joseph, while the one in Luke is that of Mary.